Chapter 14. Larinna. Nobody was trying to kill them, and that made Larinna very nervous indeed. Just as they had feared, the crew of the Unforgiven had arrived at Tribute Peak, a squat and gloomy island located at the heart of what Faisal had referred to as the Wilds, to find that another crew of pirates had gotten there first. There had been no roar of gunfire by way of a welcome, however, and the mercenary ship hardly seemed ready to launch an ambush. Her sails were furled, her cannons silent, and when Adelheid cautiously had them pull alongside, her decks were empty. "This is a very strange way to behave, yes?" Faisal commented unnecessarily as they boarded, moving below decks with their swords drawn and pistols at the ready. "To leave a ship unguarded like this?" "Well, they were expecting us yesterday," Adelheid reminded him. "Perhaps they assumed we'd been sunk and went ashore to get the treasure for themselves." "If Athena's fortune really is here, it would be a tempting prize for any crew," Faisal agreed, then pouted slightly as he saw Adelheid's glare. "Please do not be angry, Captain. You talk in your sleep, that is all." Adelheid harumphed, but said, "Very well. So we all know what we're looking for. First things first, though. We secure this ship and moor the Unforgiven somewhere out of sight. I don't want anyone stealing away with her while we're ashore." Though they searched the abandoned vessel from end to end and back again, the only sign of life turned out to be a couple of scurrying weevils. Ned offered to transport a few of the ship's furnishings back to Adelheid's cabin and restore some of its former glory, but she shook her head. "If all goes well, we'll need every last inch of room for the plunder we'll be bringing home," she assured him. "Yeah, but," Ned protested, "what if all doesn't go well?" "We'll be dead." "Oh." Ned seemed satisfied enough with that answer, and together they nestled the Unforgiven beneath a rocky outcropping that hid her from view, before heading ashore, crunching across a barren coastline made of glassy volcanic rock. "On strangled shores my ship you seek," Larinna recited from memory. "Begin your search at Tribute Peak." Well, here we are. Now what? "It is like a riddle, you see," Faisal explained, as they picked their way across the uneven stones. "Every mind is different, so we must think of it like a puzzle to be solved. The word shores mean we are more likely to find what we are seeking along the coast than inland, for example." "Fair enough, but strangled? What is there that strangles?" "Snakes," Ned offered hopefully. "Badly fitted shirts. A gallows." "Vines," Adelheid said, confidently, pointing forward with her sword. Ahead of them, the craggy shoreline curved sharply outward, and they could see that the rocks and outcroppings up ahead were coated in a thick latticework of brambles, sickly green with blood-red thorns peppering their length. In the very center of the twisting forest, they could just about discern the remains of a small sloop that had been consumed by the crawling creepers, its rotting hull barely visible within the overgrowth. "I'd say that more or less describes a ship, if we're being generous," Larinna said dryly. "Simeon must have been caught up by a storm or a tidal wave of some kind. What do we do next?" "We still need to get closer." Adelheid drew her sword once more, as did the others, and little by little they hacked their way toward the beached wreck. Even with the fresh blades they'd acquired at Thieves' Haven, it was hard work, and Larinna swore once or twice that a few of the brambles she chopped away regrew themselves shortly after. Eventually they reached the remains of the sad little sloop. As Adelheid held the riddle up for the others to inspect, More words seemed to flow across the page, as if penned by the hand of some ghostly author. That's why we had to steal the original parchment, Larinna realized. The riddle only reveals itself in stages. Once the words had settled down, 4 more lines had appeared on the scroll. Adelheid flipped it over in her fingers so that she could read the new directions out loud. I joined the birds atop their roost, and once inside I soon deduced my place below the tumbling sands, with light and shadow 'neath my hands. The 4 of them mused on this for a moment. Well, we have to start somewhere, Adelheid said. I assume there must be some birds somewhere on this wretched island. Does anyone have any idea how we go about finding where they like to sleep? A thunderous blast made them all jump out of their skin, and they turned to glare at Ned, whose smoking pistol was still aiming into the sky. As they watched, he pointed to the distant hilltop where a startled flock of seagulls were circling, having been startled by the sound. After a few moments, they disappeared back into the shadow of a large cave mouth high on the hillside. Up there, maybe? Very good, Ned, my friend, Faisal said happily, patting him on the back, or at least as far up it as he could reach. Although perhaps a little warning next time will help keep my grey hairs at bay for a few years longer, Larinna was staring at the distant cave. That's a long way up, she said doubtfully. Do you think there'll be a pathway? Only one way to find out. Adelheid took the lead, chopping and slicing once more until they were clear of the vines and could move more freely toward the base of the hill. There did seem to be a path of sorts, a narrow trail that zigzagged its way through more of the jagged rocks. It was narrow, and one side dropped treacherously away into a tangled, thorny jungle down below, but it was the only way they could see to reach the bird-filled cave. They picked their way up the hillside single file, taking their time and stopping to fill their flasks at a shallow pool. The water was cloudy here and tasted slightly sour, but they choked it down regardless, for the day was sticky and deceptively warm. Little by little they ascended and were almost to the summit when Larinna felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She couldn't explain which slight sound or shifting of shadows first gave her the clue that something was wrong, or what survival instinct it was that compelled her to scream, "Get down!" before flattening herself against the rocky wall with her arms spread. There was a tremendous series of crashes and booms as huge boulders tumbled down from overhead, carrying dust and smaller stones in their wake. Larinna scrabbled around, blinded for a moment by clouds of grit and dirt, trying to get a sense of the others. She wondered, helplessly, if they'd had time to avoid the deadly avalanche, or if the rocks had carried them helplessly down the hillside. She heard a bellow of pure rage, a voice so deep and loud it just had to be Ned. As the dust settled, Larinna saw that he'd thrown his bulk across both Faisal and Adelheid to protect them, and was now bleeding from a dozen places, though this didn't seem to slow him down. He began to leap from rock to rock, climbing with remarkable speed. Overhead, Larinna could make out the crew of the ship they'd discovered, all of whom were scrambling for their weapons. Clearly they hadn't expected any survivors of their little ambush, least of all ones who were now lunging toward them with murder in their hearts. Larinna got to her feet and took the longer way around, sprinting around another bend in the path and arriving just in time to flatten another one of their assailants with a roundhouse punch that sent her tumbling over the cliff with a scream. Ned, who'd reached the high ledge a moment before, had grabbed 2 more of the pirates and was robbing them of their will to fight by repeatedly banging their heads together. That left one, who was already backing away down the trail until the point of Adelheid's sword in his kidneys convinced him that it would be a really, really good idea to stop moving. "That was a dirty trick," Adelheid hissed viciously into the pirate's ear, "and it might almost have been a clever one, except for one thing. You missed." She watched as Ned released his two opponents, tossing their limp forms into the sticker bush below. "Lucky for you, I want some answers, so that gives you a few more minutes to enjoy walking and talking." "Do your worst," the pirate growled, yellowing teeth bared in a snarl of defiance. "I've got nothing to say to the likes of you." "Oh?" Adelheid looked a little crestfallen for a moment, and then shot him. The pirate's mouth was an O of surprise as he slumped downward, his prone form tumbling along the steep path before vanishing over the edge. But Adelheid was already striding onward, toward the looming cave mouth. The others had no choice but to pursue her, hands moving to their lanterns as they pressed on into the darkness of the cave. Far below in the jungle, the fallen pirate's body began to fade, outlined in an ethereal fire. After a moment, it was as if he'd never been. "That's creepy." Staring down the long canyon ahead of them, Larinna found herself agreeing with Ned. The cave had eventually given way to a narrow gully, one on which the sky could be glimpsed high overhead. It was tall and imposing, and both walls were lined with hundreds of roosting seagulls. They could feel pair after pair of beady black eyes staring down at them as they walked in single file, keeping conversation to a minimum and trying very hard not to think about what they were treading in. No one wanted to risk causing another panic that would result in a whirlwind of beating wings, scrabbling talons, and above all, lots of very nervous birds over their heads. Fortunately, the canyon soon opened out, and they left the squawking birds behind, stepping into a large chamber lit only by shafts of weak sunlight that made it through the cracked ceiling. It was man-made, clearly, though it looked far more ancient even than the fort at which they'd encountered Simeon. Huge square panels coated the walls, each adorned with a single symbol, while 4 braziers marked the corners of a raised stone dais at the far end of the room. The centerpiece of the whole chamber, however, had to be a large bowl-like shape forged from bronze and suspended near the ceiling. It was filled with a fine golden powder, and the stopper wedged at its lowest point suggested that should someone give the dangling rope a good tug, its contents would swiftly pour out and into a small aperture below. "Tumbling sands indeed," Faisal remarked, "though I see nothing to suggest a light or a shadow. Do you think we are perhaps supposed to wait until nightfall?" "Not a chance," Adelheid said firmly. "Not when there could be more pirates on the way." She reached past Faisal, grabbed the rope connected to the bowl's huge cork, and yanked on it as hard as she could. As the first grains of sand tumbled through the air and vanished into the darkness, the chamber began to transform itself around them. The wall panels, which had previously been little more than unremarkable slabs of stone, began to shine brightly with a number of luminous symbols. Larinna moved swiftly to the center of the chamber, along with the others, trying to take it all in as the hiss of the pouring sand intensified. A mountain, a tree, some sort of lizard, a swirl that could be anything. Faisal had moved to a stand by a panel with a crown on it, tracing his fingers across the glowing shape to discover that it moved beneath his fingers. He pushed experimentally, and the stone recessed into the wall, only to slide back into place the instant he relieved the pressure. Larinna kept searching the walls, cursing Adelheid's impatience. Already the sound had dripped below the rim of the bowl, and they were no closer to understanding the meaning of the riddle. If they ran out of time here, she suspected, there'd be no second chances. Their quest would come to an abrupt end, and they'd be sailing home shamefaced and empty-handed. A bird, a wave, a flower, she thought desperately, an eye, a sun, a skull. Wait. I think I've got it, she called, bolting over the dais to stand by the panel that bore the sun's likeness. This symbolizes light, right? She pushed against the stone, feeling it slide back into the wall with a satisfying click. Now, what about shadow? Now it was Adelheid's turn to stare around at the walls, as the last of the sand began to trickle away. Finally, she spotted what she was looking for. A circle divided by a curving crescent, which she could only hope symbolized the moon to whoever had devised this strange test. She lunged across the chamber, almost tripping, and her hands struck the panel just as the last grains of sand dropped out of sight. All at once, the symbols winked out, and the stone was nothing but stone once more. Larinna didn't dare speak, let alone move her hands away from the panel she was pushing against. Had they been too late? Was their answer even correct? There were 4 low pops, and the braziers around the central dais came to life, one by one, their flames precisely matching the colored symbols. Only then did the dais itself begin to glow with the same bright lines as they'd seen on the panels, only far more intricate. Sweeping curves wrapped around complicated squiggles etched in stone, while wavy lines forked and forked again before disappearing. "It's a map!" Faisal exclaimed triumphantly. "A map of this island! Ha! How much more elegant than a piece of parchment! Have you ever seen anything like it, Adelheid?" He began to trace his fingers over the lines and contours, scrutinizing the dais intently. "Never," she admitted. "But then, this is no mere treasure box we're going after. This is Athena's fortune. It makes sense that it would be well protected." "And possibly well guarded," Faisal mused. "What does the riddle say?" Adelheid blinked, clearly having forgotten the parchment in her possession. New words were already forming, and she spread the parchment so they could all read the newly added verse. "A fallen titan lies alone, glory waits upon her throne. To reach the sanctum will require a gift to match his heart's desire." No sooner had Adelheid finished reading this out loud than the image upon the dais began to fade, growing dimmer and dimmer until the detailed map was quite unreadable. Finally, even the braziers snuffed themselves out, and the chamber was quiet and still once more, perhaps forever. "Wonderful," said Adelheid bitterly. "Now we'll have to scour the entire island, and who knows how many more hidden passages this place has in store." "Scour? I think not," Faisal replied, a mischievous grin on his face. "I shall lead the way, yes?" "You worked out the riddle already?" Larinna asked, dubiously, dusting off her hands and settling in at the rear of the group. Faisal would not be drawn as to their next destination, however, clearly enjoying being in charge for once. Larinna felt tempted to shake an explanation out of him, given how serious their situation was, but Adelheid seemed content to let him have his fun. They passed back through the gully of slumbering seagulls and emerged from the cave atop the rocky hillside. They couldn't see any new sails on the horizon and dared to hope that the other ships might finally have given up their pursuit of the Unforgiven and her crew. But they kept a wary lookout just to be safe, having come so far and sacrificed too much to let complacency prove their undoing. They followed the coastline for a full hour under Faisal's direction, edging along the rocky outcroppings and hopping nimbly from stone to cross a frothing river rapid. Finally, the pathway opened out onto a vast plateau, and the sight was nothing short of breathtaking. 10 enormous statues rose before them, easily over 100 feet high, carved from the same glassy rock that formed the island's shores. Each was of a human figure, some male, some female, and each was seated in a high-backed chair with an expression of stern, blank-eyed benevolence on its face. "Are they kings and queens?" Larinna asked. She had learned very little about royalty growing up. Anyone who might have arrived on her home island wearing a big gold crown and declaring they were in charge would have soon been sent on their way again, only without the crown and whatever else they'd arrived with. She had to admit that the enormous statues resembled what she'd imagined a king or a queen to look like, though. Even the statue at the far end of the line, which had toppled from its perch at some point in the long-distant past, had an untarnished nobility about its weather-worn features. "Wait, this is the fallen Titan, isn't it, Faisal?" "I should say so, yes." Faisal clapped his hands expectantly. "And how impressive she is! I would say that they look like gods and goddesses myself, but I suppose it doesn't matter one way or the other." They were standing in the shadow of the statue now. It rose like a high cliff overhead, huge enough that they could have lit a campfire in her palm. "Athena was a goddess," Adelheid mused. "But you're right, Faisal. What was the second line? Something about glory upon the throne?" One by one, they looked up at the gigantic monument on which the statue had once been seated, a vast lump of rock that rose imposingly into the sky. They made a complete circuit, hoping to find some handholds or other means of purchase, but the edifice was as smooth as glass, sheer and unclimbable. "We should try the cannon trick again," Larinna said doubtfully. But Adelheid shook her head. "There's no way to get the Unforgiven close enough, and even if we could, it'd be like firing you at a wall. Funny, but wasteful." She smirked at Larinna's expression and added, "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. What if this is about width rather than height?" To illustrate her point, she stood in the gap between the base of the throne and the cracked torso of the statue and spread her arms out wide. Faisal clearly understood what their captain was implying, for his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "I know that you have always been the most nimble of us all, Adelheid, but this strikes me as foolhardy even by your unparalleled standards of recklessness. Surely you have not forgotten that unfortunate incident at Devil's Ridge?" "Nor have I forgotten that you still owe me 5 gold pieces," Adelheid snapped. "I can do this. I'm probably the only one who can do this, unless any of you has a better idea." She looked from one to the other, as if challenging them to speak up, then began to fiddle with the buckles on her coat. Once divested of her heavy outer garments, her feathered hat and anything else that might weigh her down, Adelheid seemed suddenly a lot smaller and quite a lot younger. She gave a sardonic bow, for pirates never curtsied, and turned to face the statue. "Be nice to me, lady," she told it sternly, then stepped right up toward the huge face and began to climb. The statue's carving, not to mention its collapse, had left a series of small cracks and grooves here and there. Adelheid used these to ascend, wedging her stockinged toes into gaps and clinging stubbornly to the stone with numb fingers. It was slow going, even so, and at one point She had to reverse her course and seek a different route when a promising handhold crumbled away. At last, she stood atop the statue's shoulder and took the opportunity for a brief rest, waving merrily down at her crew far below, before setting off once again, tracing the outline of one immense limb. Larinna and the others kept pace with her on the ground, losing sight of the distant figure from time to time as it was obscured by a curve of the arm or a sharp fold of the great stone cloak. Finally, Adelheid reached the point where the body of the broken statue came to an abrupt halt, leaving empty air between her and the throne's enormous seat. The wind whipped at her hair as she assessed the distance. "It can't be more than 10 feet or so," she told herself crossly. "You've managed that before. You can make this easily. It's definitely possible. Definitely probable, anyway. Maybe. And a little scary. But everyone's watching." "Oh, what the hell," she muttered, and leapt. There hadn't been space for much of a run-up, but a life spent leaping about the rigging, bounding between ships during raids, and outrunning anyone who might want their money back, had served Adelheid well. Even so, her outstretched fingers were barely able to grasp the ledge that formed the seat of the throne, and she struggled to keep her purchase on the smooth stone as her legs scrabbled. Inch by inch, muscles screaming in protest, she brought her hands farther and farther onto safe ground. Then her forearms, and finally she hauled herself to safety, rolling onto her back and offering silent thanks as she stared up at the reddening sky. "You alive, Captain?" Ned's voice echoed up, and Adelheid peered over the side of the throne at the distant figures, giving another wave before clambering to her feet and looking around. There wasn't much to see, for the plateau was largely featureless, save for some sort of raised plinth tucked away in the corner. She ambled over for a closer look, rubbing her fingers to work the feeling back. It reminded her of the ship's capstan, and as she got closer, she could see that it turned in much the same way. Bracing herself as the rock beneath her was slippery, she began to spin the contraption clockwise, wondering if anything would happen, and how she'd know when it did. She found perspective suddenly shifting, for each turn seemed to lower her down into the stone. Larinna, who was leaning against the base of the throne far below, jumped and spun round as the monument suddenly came to life beneath her shoulders. An imperceptible crack was beginning to widen in what had seemed like a featureless surface, and an entire section of the throne's base was retracting, swinging open by degrees as Adelheid worked the mechanism far above. Before long, a wide entranceway revealed itself, and light flared as the pirates peered into the darkness. It was Adelheid's lantern, for she was perched atop the capstan inside, the mechanism having descended fully into the throne. "Miss me?" she asked glibly, before insisting that they wait for her while she retrieved and replaced her clothing and accoutrements. "Better," she admitted, adjusting her hat. "Now I feel like a pirate again." The passageway beneath the huge throne descended sharply, with flight after flight of stairs spiraling around a treacherous gap. Faisal could not resist dropping a stone down into the shaft, counting the seconds in a low voice and waiting for the echo to come. It didn't. They took each step cautiously, for a few were beginning to crumble, and the deeper they went, the more perilous their route became. Before long, they were being forced to take exaggerated strides over gaps in the stairway, and finally small leaps to get from step to step. They were all very grateful when the stairs finally came to an end, and another passageway beckoned, for it seemed far more navigable, and they were already exhausted. They moved through the gloom for only a few hundred yards, however, before they came across the door. It was sturdy, made from two huge slabs of carved stone, covered from floor to ceiling in yet more markings. It was ornate, with a pattern of diamonds around a large golden key, with a hole in its center. And it was, much as Ned heaved and strained against it in an effort to force the stones apart, most definitely locked. "What now?" Adelheid asked impatiently. "There has to be some way through, now that we've come all this way. Another puzzle, perhaps?" She traced her fingers across the metal of the key shape, as if she could somehow force her brain to comprehend it. Faisal, who had been studying the door for a long while, coughed. "I cannot say for sure, of course, but take a step back. Does the design not seem at all familiar to you?" Adelheid did as she was asked, pursing her lips and looking for all the world like she was assessing a piece of fine art. "I suppose," she said slowly. "It looks similar to the crest of the gold hoarders. Not that that helps us in any way." Larinna had no clue who the gold hoarders were, though she vaguely remembered hearing their name mentioned once before, but that didn't matter. She was running the final lines of the riddle over and over in her mind. Finally, she stepped forward. "Does anyone have any money?" Adelheid gave her a strange look. "No, because it's all on the other side of that door," she snapped. Then her expression grew curious. "What are you up to now?" "I just need a coin," Larinna persisted. "You mean to say we haven't got a single gold piece between us?" Looking at the shamefaced expression of the others, she sighed deeply and reached into her own pockets, finding only a handful of coppers left over from her trade with Wilbur. It felt like a lifetime ago. Sighing, she sank to the floor and began to tug at her boot, feeling the familiar weight of her last gold piece in its usual resting spot, and tugged it free from between her toes. She held it up for a moment, inspecting it somewhat sadly, before moving forward and placing it in the hole at the very center of the key. "This has to work," she thought. "What else would be a gold hoarder's desire?" To her relief, the coin seemed to do the trick. The two stone slabs slid slowly apart with a deep, grinding noise, startling a few beetles and revealing yet another passageway. No more words of wisdom from Simeon appeared on the parchment this time, though they stared at it intently. It seemed as though their journey had reached its end. "Well now," Adelheid said finally, folding up the parchment for the final time and drawing her sword. "This is where things get exciting."